What's up, everybody? UFC 303's co-main event this weekend between Brian Ortega and Diego Lopez is one that, as soon as this fight got announced, first of all, it came out of nowhere, right? We saw Conor McGregor, Michael Chandler have to be removed from the card. Conor McGregor in injury. We saw Yuri Prochazka, Alex Pineda announced, and then they announced Brian Ortega versus Diego Lopez at a co-main event. And I just was like, whoa. I mean, first of all, that came out of nowhere. And second, what an unbelievable matchup, right? You got the grizzled vet in Brian Ortega, who seems to have been in just about every fight you can imagine, has kind of been through it over the past few years, is going in there against an up-and-coming rising star in Diego Lopez. And first, shout out to the UFC for making this matchup happen and both guys being willing to step in on short notice to take this fight, right? Brian Ortega ranked number 3, Diego Lopez in the back end of the rankings. I believe he's ranked number 14. I love this matchup, man. I love when the UFC, I've been on the record on my channel saying, guys, look, I love when the UFC decides to take this young gun who is just kind of running through people and seems to have figured it out, and they give him a few steps up in competition, but then they just kind of throw him into that top 5 Shark Tank and say, let's see what it's about, right? We've seen this with Khamzat Chimaev, Gilbert Burns, right? We saw this with Sean O'Malley, Petr Yan, and the list goes on and on. And sometimes it works out, right? And then other times you kind of, I don't want to say get exposed, but you get humbled a little bit, right? You get to show that there's a little bit of levels to this. And in a matchup with Brian Ortega and Diego Lopez, I mean, well, what are we looking at here, right? I mean, we're looking at just an unbelievable fight that I can see going a few different ways, right? What we've seen from Diego since he's been in the UFC thus far, right? Takes a fight on short notice against Movsar Evloev, which he looked unbelievable in that fight. I would argue and say that that's probably the most we've seen Movsar tested since he's been in the UFC, and he's undefeated. People are talking about he should be getting a title shot here soon, and how basically dominant he has looked, and how, the improvements we've seen in the striking of Movsar. We know about the wrestling. And Diego Lopez, yes, he was controlled on the ground, but he held his own, right? He was threatening submissions off of his back. He's got incredible jiu-jitsu. But one of the things with Diego that we've seen over the past 3 fights, right? Dating back to the Tucker fight, the Pat Sabatini matchup, and then at UFC 300 against Sadiq Youssef. Just the power and the boxing of Diego Lopez. And he started to implement some of those low kicks into his game, right? He kind of really reminds me, honestly, of Charles Oliveira, right? That forward pressure style, likes to kind of get in your face, not give you a lot of time to kind of get a feel for what's going on in there, to kind of figure out your opponent. Like, Diego doesn't give you that time to breathe, right? He's on you the minute the fight starts. The minute the bell strikes, he's like a bat out of hell, races across, gets in your face, starts blasting leg kicks, gets in on the inside and starts letting some of those nasty uppercuts go. We saw him hurt Sadiq Youssef bad. He's a big guy for the weight class. He's got good power. And then in the back of your mind, you have to worry about this submission game. But coming into a fight with a guy like Brian Ortega, right? A lot of people are talking about the jiu-jitsu skills on display here of Diego Lopez. Brian Ortega has some of the best jiu-jitsu in the game, man. He is, just when you're talking about high-level jiu-jitsu, Brian Ortega inside the UFC is one of those names that comes to mind. But along with that, Brian Ortega is just a G-man. He's a warrior. He's got grit. He's got heart. And, most fighters have that, obviously. But with Brian Ortega, there's a little bit of a different tier, right? From what we've seen inside of the UFC from T-City is just a guy that's just willing to go to hell and back to make it happen, right? We saw him, against Max Holloway. Things didn't go his way. Kind of got embarrassed a little bit in that matchup, right? Max Holloway putting a beating on him, showing how to block punches. Like, not exactly the greatest thing to see in that matchup. But then he goes back, right? Kind of takes a look at himself in the mirror, reinvents himself, comes out, puts on a masterclass against Chan Sung Jung, shaves his head, bald-headed Ortega, man, came out like a different dude, throwing spinning elbows, stance switching, made a lot of improvements. But then that's where things got a little rocky, right? They do the Ultimate Fighter, goes out there against Alexander Volkanovski, put Volk in a submission that's still, as I'm making this video right now, I still don't know how the hell Volk got out of that sub that Brian put him in. That was as tight as it gets. Volk was able to get out of that thing. And Brian Ortega in that fight still had some really good moments. Then we saw a little bit of a layoff, comes back against Yair Rodriguez, the injury, gets it back on Yair Rodriguez. And that was a performance that I came on my channel right away and was like, look, give Brian Ortega his credit, man. The way that he went out there against Yair Rodriguez, after everything he's been through, the ups and downs, the injuries, getting a little older, and coming out there and being able to weather the storm early against Yair Rodriguez, right? He got dropped, he got hurt, he was getting his head spun around by some of those shots by Yair, because Yair's a wild man, dude. He's got some good striking. And Brian Ortega was able to weather the storm and ultimately sub Yair Rodriguez. The problem I have in this matchup with Brian Ortega is, what are the motivations, right? Brian Ortega has been on the record saying, look, the way it's looking at featherweight is we got Max Holloway who's in line for a title shot, which he kind of was basically exposing the fact that Ely and Holloway are most likely going to be fighting. You got Volk waiting in the wing. And then, so Ortega's like, well, when the hell am I going to get a title shot? I'm just going to be sitting around, kind of squatting on my number 3 ranking, kind of waiting around. He's like, it's looking like I'm going to be making a move up to lightweight. So when you see him take a short notice fight and you hear him talking about wanting to move to lightweight and waiting around to get a title shot, like, it just doesn't sound like there's a lot of motivation for Brian Ortega coming into this fight. However, that doesn't mean that he's not going to try to win, right? Brian Ortega, he knows what he's getting into in this matchup. A fast starting Diego Lopez he's got better striking than Brian. But what Brian does have is he does have the grit. He has the experience and he has the heart, and he does have improved stand-up, right? Brian Ortega, he does a really good job stand switching. He cuts pretty good angles, but one of the issues that we've seen is he's incredibly hittable. And as he's gotten a little bit later in his career, you see Brian take a shot quite a bit different, right? Before it would just be you could spin his whole head around, and it was like nothing, and he'd just keep marching forward, to now he gets hit and spins his head around. It's kind of a, obviously you're getting hit by Yair Rodriguez, you're getting hit by world-class fighters. It's just a little bit different because of the damage that has added up over the years for Brian Ortega. And coming into this fight, I'm a little concerned for Brian, right? In the first round, we know what Diego's going to do, man. Barring that, he gets away from what he's been doing the past 3 fights. He's going to come out like a bat out of hell. He's going to get on Brian Ortega right away, not give him room to operate and think, because Brian loves that ability to kind of get a feel for the fight, move around, kind of throw out a jab, feel around, switch stances, kind of move around. Diego doesn't give you time to do that. He doesn't want you to kind of get a grasp for what's going on. He doesn't want you to be thinking other than just reacting like, oh shit, this guy's coming at me, I need to start covering up. And that's what Diego does. He forces you to just be like, oh shit, like, we're in this thing, man. And Brian Ortega does have the experience, and he's been in there with great competition to be able to deal with that. The problem is Diego hits so damn hard, man, and his power is sensational. He has very, very good jiu-jitsu, to where if this fight does hit the floor, it's not to say that, I think if anybody's going to submit anybody, I think it would be Ortega submitting Lopez. I still think Brian, has the edge in terms of the jiu-jitsu. But Brian Ortega's takedown offense has also improved over the past few years, right? We saw that against Yair Rodriguez. But again, Yair has been shown that he's pretty easy to take down at this point, right? Some of the guys in the top of the division who, like Alexander Volkanovski, they've been able to take down Yair Rodriguez pretty easily. We saw Josh Emmett be able to take down Yair Rodriguez. And those guys are big, powerful guys. No harm, no foul there. But Brian Ortega, he showed that he's improved in terms of the takedown department. He was able to get Yair down, and then he was able to ultimately submit him. Now, can he do that to Diego Lopez? I just don't think so, man. I just don't think he can, because Diego Lopez, not only is he big for the weight class, but he's powerful. And when we see guys that cut down to featherweight and they're that tall and they're that big, it's normally like they're not exactly the most powerful. They may have some speed and some lankiness to them, but Diego Lopez has like that true one shot where if he lands it, man, you're rattled. You're shaking the cobwebs, you're scrambling, and that's just what I'm concerned for Brian Ortega in this matchup. So prediction, I got to go Diego Lopez by first round finish. I think that this is the first time that we see Brian Ortega actually get stopped, right? I'm not saying it's going to be a flush KO. I think the ref has to come in and stop, as Ortega's tried to get his wits about him, and he's covering up, and Diego Lopez is just uncorking some nasty shots. I think he gets on the inside. I think he dirty boxes with Brian Ortega, because as good as Brian Ortega's submission game is, and as good as his grappling has been, Brian Ortega only has 3 knockouts in his career, right? And to think that he's going to come in here and knock out Diego Lopez, just don't think that that's the most likely thing. I think that that's probably the least likely thing to happen. Watch that happen now that I kind of ruled that out. But I want to hear from you all down in the comments. Like this video, comment your prediction below. Do you think Lopez gets it done, or do you think T-City gets it done? Subscribe to the channel, help your boy out. I would appreciate it. See you next time.